Well, John, just to kind of get our conversation started, I thought we might talk a little bit about the title of your book and how you and Tim came to collaborate with 10 other writers the 10 other writers who contributed to the book.
Yeah, so the title. I think I was the one who proposed the subtitle, and then the editor threw in the title, which works well. I think the wordplay is meant to say, even though we can and should find common ground with people who are different than us, even when we can't agree on the common good, we can still find common ground. The ordinary practices that let us do that are so hard to achieve these days that it actually ends up being uncommon ground. So that's the purpose of the title there. And this book emerged out of a few years of collaboration where Tim and I were slowly realizing in conversations and emails that what he was then preaching at the time at Redeemer was very close to the kinds of things I was speaking and writing about to different audiences from my university vantage point. So we wrote an article, I think it was in 2015, that brought together some of the common themes we've been exploring, and then in a series of conversations since that article came up with the book idea. And I think what I really liked about how this book unfolded is pretty early on we decided, rather than a book length treatment of propositions, which is the typical academic approach to writing,
Yep.
we could focus on stories, and not just our stories, but stories of some friends. And so we spent actually probably the most time on the book just figuring out who the right collaborators would be, and bringing together this mix of people to try to demonstrate the breadth of reach and scope and perspectives and God's witnessing community in this country. We limited it to Protestants. We figured it was that was hard enough.
Yep.
So it's an intra-Protestant effort, but other than that, a pretty diverse group.
Yeah. And I understand that when you talk about bringing this group together, you actually did bring this group together at one point in the process of the book.
We did, and by a scheduling miracle. It's weird to think back to this time now that almost none of us is flying or traveling. But back in the day, we decided to have a meeting in St. Louis, and we really front-ended that priority with all of the authors. When we invited them to contribute to the book, we said, and by the way, we really need you at this meeting. And so all 12 of us gathered in St. Louis. And that started with a 3 or 4 hour long dinner where we're around a common table and just listening to shared stories. And that was, I think, the moment that this book became something different than your regular edited volume. And it became a project that we were all collectively invested in and invested in one another. And I think there was just something pretty beautiful about, I mean, I knew some of these people fairly well. Tish Warren has been a longtime friend, and Tom Lynn I know well. But other people I was just meeting for the first time. And yet as we went around and shared stories and pain points and joys and disappointments, there was this common thread around the whole table that was quite powerful and inspiring.
Yeah. I know I sensed in reading the book that there was a kind of a cohesion that came about through the essays that I wondered if the literal collaboration around a table had helped build.
I think, yeah, and more than anything, just instilling trust in each other. I mean, a number of you have written yourselves, and you know that the writing process can be quite vulnerable, and the editing process is vulnerable in both directions. And I think the sense of shared trust that we had to say, look, I need you to make this edit for the sake of the book, or you might want to make this point, but actually it's going to be more helpful if you make it in this different tone or register. And people were quite responsive to that. There was a lot of editing, and there was very little pushback or sort of individual ownership.
That's terrific. That sounds like it sounds pretty unique among when you gather a lot of writers together to contribute to something. So,
well, I think, one of the things that, at least in our internal criteria that we were thinking about, is we wanted people who had different spheres of influence and who could reach wide audiences, but who were relatively low ego people. And that really ended up mattering. I mean, nobody in this collaboration is a massive ego. I mean, some of them, have quite large followings, but they're all pretty humble people and easy to work with, which is not always the case.
No, that's for sure. Well, One of the things in both this book and in your previous book, Confident Pluralism, you advocate is for three civic virtues that you describe as being necessary for establishing common or uncommon ground: humility, patience, and tolerance. I wanted to ask you why these three, and particularly what you mean by tolerance, which is often regarded negatively in the Christian community.
Yeah, so I came up with that formulation of three. I think I was writing this in 2014, so I'm actually not even sure I remember why I picked on those three. It was actually remarkable, though. Later on, sometime in between Confident Pluralism and this book, I was talking with Andy Crouch, who many of you know, and Andy said, you talk about tolerance, humility, and patience, but you have them in the wrong order, because it really should be humility, patience, and tolerance, and those then map on to faith, hope, and love. And I thought, oh, well, that's remarkable, great job. So I think I'll take that. And it was really helpful to get that mapping from Andy. I think originally I was just trying to envision what are the civic postures that we need to embrace people who are different than us and to hang in there for the relationship rather than just the argument. I mean, this was 2014 was already nasty, but it's gotten a lot worse since then. And the tendency that so many of us have to surround ourselves with our own priors, or to not engage or not stick with the conversation. And so that was the real reason for those three in particular.
Yeah, yeah. So can you say a little more about tolerance?
Yeah, it's funny because in different in different audiences, I get pushback on different ones of these. So humility is one that is often, when I'm speaking with a non-Christian audience, people push back on humility, and what does that mean? But with tolerance, and Christian circles in particular, people feel squishy about the idea of tolerance. And I think I want to do two things with that word. First is to rehabilitate it from what many of us hear it as, especially in the university or higher ed context, where, at least in my circles, when someone says tolerance at WashU, the presumption or the implicit understanding is you only tolerate me if you accept everything about me and all that I believe in. You be you, I'll be me, and we accept each other completely and fully without any judgment. And that's a philosophical impossibility, because none of us exhibits that kind of tolerance across the board. Every single one of us can name beliefs or ideologies that we just think are evil. And that's true whether you're a Christian or not. So there is no such thing as unbounded tolerance. So we all are forced to do some kind of coexistence version of tolerance. And as I mentioned, I think in Confident Pluralism, Bernard Williams famously said the problem with tolerance is that it's most needed for those who are intolerable, which is true, but and hard. So what does it mean to just push toward something more modest than full acceptance? And what I try to argue around the concept of tolerance is it begins by distinguishing people from the ideas they hold. And can we first focus on people as human beings? And for Christians especially, this should be low-hanging fruit for us, because we know and we believe that everybody we encounter is an image bearer created in God's image. So no matter how bizarre or crazy or different or even evil we think someone else is, that person is also an image bearer. And can we find something in that person to push toward common ground? It doesn't mean we accept the beliefs or viewpoints or ideologies of everyone we encounter, but it does mean that we work hard to start with the person. And then, and this is, I think, in a lot of this stuff, I just think Christians have a leg up on it, because tolerance rooted in a Christian virtue of love means we go far beyond just mere tolerance, but that we love lavishly. We love our neighbors, we love our enemies, and we're called to that gracious love because Christ first loved us.
I love that. I do love that. You talk about yourself in your essay, your contribution to the book, as a translator. And I wondered if you might explain a little of what you mean by that, and what that looks like in your practice as a faculty member, and what that looks like in the church.
Yeah, so one of the nice benefits of being the book's editor is I could assign myself the chapter that I wanted. So I gave myself the role of the translator, because on reflection, as I thought about what can I add to this conversation in my own life experiences, and as I thought about it first professionally, I realized a huge part of what I do professionally is translating. And so I started with my experience, not as a teacher, but as a lawyer. And when I would represent clients and litigate cases, my huge value add was being able to translate effectively concepts and ideas that my clients had. I worked for the DoD for a while and had a lot of very high-tech cases with engineers and scientists who were brilliant but could not convey in plain English what they were doing and why it mattered. And so my job as their lawyer was to go to the decision maker and say, here's what this guy's saying, or here's what this woman's saying, and here's why it's really important and why you should decide the case in this way. And I could only do that if I understood what I was translating and to whom I was translating that idea. And that, as I thought about that, then that naturally flowed into my teaching as well. That's the classroom challenge, is always seeing a new group of students, even if I'm teaching the same course for the 6th, 7th, 8th time, it's new to them. And if I don't realize and remember who they are as students and where they're coming from, I will be ineffective at translating even those ideas that are just almost embedded and intuitive to me at this point. And then in the church, translating the church, and this is where, particularly with this group, I think there'll be some resonances, but those of us who are in the university world know that we are in a place where we're straddling two often oppositional communities or environments. And so from the university side, there's this sense that Christians are backwards or unintelligent or not wanting to play ball with the rest of us. And so we've got to work to be a witnessing community to the university. But there's also a massive challenge back to the church where too many Christians and too many churches think that universities are where kids go to lose their faith and they're just hostile to all things Christian. And the translation work for me as a Christian faculty member, and for many of you who are either faculty or who are campus ministers working with faculty, is to say, no, here's how we can see what is not just okay, but actually really beautiful and good about what the university is doing. It doesn't mean that we work at, most of us don't work at Christian institutions, but we work in places that are that are part of God's created order, where people are using the minds that God has given them. Some of them are Christian and some of them aren't, but there's the production of knowledge and the conveying of information and education in a way that's actually quite beautiful and has a lot of value and importance to society.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that it sounds like you're involved in translating is something that's you call the Carver Project, which is a unique initiative around which you and a number of Washington University faculty have gathered. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and the significance of the name and how this kind of advances this Uncommon Ground project?
Yeah, we started the Carver Project about 2.5 years ago here at Washington University, and our mission is to empower Christian faculty and students to serve and connect university, church, and society. So part of that translation work we were just talking about, but also in furtherance for our neighbors around us. And we started this after realizing a couple of things. First, we had a group of Christian faculty who were here already at WashU, who were leaders in their field, great classroom teachers, respected by the university, and just sort of trying to sense, why does God have all these people here together at the same time? It's pretty unique at our level of an institution to have this many faculty who are ready to be publicly Christian and excellent in what they do. And importantly, it was a group of us, because I'm actually, having been around these kinds of things for a number of years, I have a concern that a lot of them suffer from founder syndrome, where and especially an academic or a Christian academic effort becomes one person deep, and the entire enterprise rests upon the reputation or work of one individual. And I just don't think that's how we're wired to create in the world. And so the fact that we have 16 Christian faculty here, all of whom are really good at what they do, and none of us really needs each other to be good in higher ed, but collectively, if we work together, then I think the synergies are really exciting. And so we named it after George Washington Carver for a number of reasons, knowing that this was someone who committed his life to higher education, was never fully accepted by the power structures that be, but then was also, as InterVarsity, is very committed to racial reconciliation, racial justice, and knowing that was a long road ahead. And then I think the other thing I'll say here is part of the reason my own desire to start something like the Carver Project was looking at my life a few years ago and thinking, okay, I'm tenured at a really great school. There are some great opportunities here, and I love the people around me. I love the classes and the research and my colleagues and students. But as an institution, this place doesn't know what its purpose is, and it never will, because of sort of the pathologies of modern higher education. Outside of a few, I think, religious schools and a few possibly state or regional schools, most of higher ed doesn't know what its purpose is. And it's just institutionally constrained from ever knowing its purpose. And so I thought, if I'm going to be around here for the next, 20, 30 years of my life, I've got to have something with a more coherent purpose, and to form a ministry of Christian faculty where we know our purpose, and we know sort of what we want to do and why. That seemed really exciting and encouraging to me. And, on the purpose question, and some of you have probably felt this too in the last few months, but the virus and the collective response of higher ed to the virus is, I just think, illustrating for all of us this vacuous nature of a lack of purpose or a lack of really institutional vision, kind of across higher ed, and the way that the different money streams tie together. So at my school, and I'm in a weird band of schools that are, Wash U, Duke, Stanford, R1 schools attached to major medical centers. That means, AKA during COVID, we're in deep trouble. So we're losing $500 million a year because of the med center side, due to shut down elective clinical care. And we have a lot of international students who can no longer come to campus. So we're down on the international programs. And all of this directly affects my job teaching law, which in any sane view of the world, you would think, why is that happening? I'm a law professor. I'm not doing clinical surgery, and I'm not usually teaching international students, but all of the revenue streams in modern higher ed tie together to complicate life for everyone. And I just think, in the same way we're all realizing, hey, cramming together those airline seats wasn't such a great idea either. We're those of us in higher ed are also seeing the structures and paths of higher ed that all of us have just assumed and not pushed back upon for a long time are actually revealing some real problems that we as Christians, I think, should be in the mix trying to address.
Well, that leads me to asking a little bit of what are some of the ways that your efforts to engage these kinds of issues in the university, what expression has that taken with the Carver Project thus far?
Yeah, probably two answers to that question. There's the pre-COVID and during COVID answer,
sure.
as many of us are finding. But a part of what we're doing at our core is to say, who are the Christian faculty? And by the way, George Stulak, who some of you know from InterVarsity, is a great partner with us and has been just a great friend and partner to bring other Christian faculty into the mix. But we try to look for those faculty who are already pretty serious about their faith and their walk, who are well established in their careers, and who are saying, how can I, as a faculty member, engage in ministry and use not only the resources, but also the reputation that God has given me in a way to advance the kingdom. And so we do things like encourage faculty-led reading groups in areas of influence. And so I have a group of Christian law students that I meet with at the law school here. We 30 to 40 students. We were meeting in my home before COVID. Now we've gone to Zoom. But we have that in the medical center and in the art school and with English PhD students. And we're just trying to find who are those Christian faculty who are ready not to be a massive campus ministry like InterVarsity, but to find those few students within their sphere of influence. And then how do we as faculty connect students with the greater church? So many students come through for 3, 4, 5 years of their program and then leave. And we want to say, while you're here, look around and let us help you find and connect resources in the church as you think about your walk and your education. So we connect law students with legal practitioners in the area who've been in the business for 15 or 20 years to say, what does it look like to be a Christian and a lawyer? And how can you think that through as a 24-year-old law student? Yeah, and then a lot of other, I think, just relationally based programs that have been the bread and butter of what we're doing. Most of them can't happen now during COVID, although we converted my garage to a semi-usable outdoor space. And so we're trying to have some very small meetings now.
Yeah.
The other two things that might be of interest, reflecting our online presence, which was something we'd wanted to do, but certainly COVID forced us to speed up the effort. We just launched a podcast that my friend and colleague Penina Laker and I co-host. She and I taught a course last spring called Law, Race, and Design. She's a graphic designer and I'm a law professor. And so we thought, can we look at the intersection of our disciplines? And it was a great course. And we did kind of a, version 1.0 podcast with that course and had a lot of fun. So we thought, well, let's just do a Carver Project podcast too. And so now we're just interviewing different Christian faculty around the country to say, tell us about your research, your scholarship, your teaching, but also what it means to be a Christian working in a non-Christian institution and how you balance those challenges and opportunities. And then the other thing we just kicked off, I'm actually teaching mine tomorrow. We have a short course series that we're calling the Carver Classroom, and we're using our faculty to teach 4-week mini courses geared toward pastors and ministry leaders. And so we're doing this seminar style. We're limiting it to 12 participants per class. And then we're on Zoom, but talking to each other. I'm doing a course on confident pluralism, which seemed like the low-hanging fruit. But my colleague, Abram Benningen, who's an English professor, is doing a 4-week course on poetry for preaching. And we have one on race, place in St. Louis. We have my colleague, John Hendricks, did one on artists in the church. And so we're just trying to think of, what's at the core of what we do and we know. Is there a way we can share this effectively and relationally with pastors and ministry leaders to help bridge that divide between university and church?
I wanted to follow up on that by asking how reproducible do you think what you're doing is for faculty groups at other campuses?
Yeah, I've gotten that question a bunch from around different faculty around the country. And a couple of things. I don't think this is franchisable. There's not a box we can say, here's what it looks like to start this at Vanderbilt. I think Vanderbilt, for example, needs to start with who are the Christian faculty at Vanderbilt and what does their community look like? And, that's a great example because there are some Christian faculty there. And so I think it's an important one necessary condition for something like this to work is a group of Christian faculty that's ready to be a community and not just individual. I think a second necessary condition is strong local churches and a willingness to partner with local churches, and then a creative effort that will be faculty led, but that is also willing to partner, creatively and broadly with other ministries. So I love it when we can partner not only with InterVarsity, but other campus ministries here. But I think, I do think it takes some time to build up the critical mass of a faculty community that can do this in a faculty-led way. And I think the temptation for a lot of Christian efforts in higher ed is to want to force that along earlier than it really can be. And so someone on university staff or someone with a Christian study center will say, here's the vision, and now let's just find the faculty. And it turns out there aren't faculty there. And so suddenly you've got to pull from, well, I know my buddy Fred was a adjunct faculty 10 years ago, so he'll count, right? And maybe, you can everyone shares the faculty title in that sense, but it's very hard to do that without, I would say, tenured faculty who are core to the institution itself. And one of the real gifts we've discovered here is we have this abundance of tenured faculty who are willing to say, we want to do this together.
Okay, well, we're going to take a break here for a moment. I want to just highlight Tim's book. Let me pull that up on the screen here. The book is Uncommon Ground, and you actually have a list here of the different contributors to the book: Lecrae, Tish Harrison Warren, Kristen D. Johnson, Claude Richard Alexander, who's going to be an Urbana speaker at the next Urbana, Shirley Hoogstra, Sarah Groves, Rudy Carrasco, Trillia Newbell, Tom Lynn, who's the president of InterVarsity, and Warren Kinghorn. And so it's quite a good lineup. I would encourage, if you have been intrigued by what you've been hearing in this conversation, that you take some time to go to wherever you buy books and pick up a copy. One thing I'll mention for our conversation, and I should have done this earlier, is that if you would like to submit questions in the chat, you may go ahead and do so at any time during our discussion. We're going to move into a Q&A time now with John with your questions. And so if you want to post those in the chat, I'll pick those up and moderate them, and we will talk together. And I will kick off with a question, as some of you may be writing questions. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and this is actually something I noted in a review I wrote of your book, was you talk at the conclusion of it, you adopt James Davison Hunter's language of faithful presence, and you articulate some practices to flesh that out. And I wonder, is faithful presence enough? What does faithful presence look like in the face of xenophobia, racism, violence against women? What do you believe Uncommon Ground engagement looks like when engaging those kinds of realities and other realities that we would call evil?
Yeah, so I do think, and we could actually add to that evil list with quite a number of other contenders there. I do think faithful presence is the right frame to have, but it's predicated upon formation and discipleship. And I think that's sort of, I think too many Christians, especially younger Christians, many of those with whom, those of us on this call are engaged, are ready to jump into the engagement or the presence part without stepping back and figuring out what the faithful part means. And so I think the long, hard work of discipleship and formation, which is only going to get harder for all kinds of reasons, for cultural reasons, for technology reasons, for patience reasons. The virus is reinforcing this as well, that formation and discipleship is hard, slow work. And unless we get there, unless we think through how and why to address all of the issues you just named from a biblical perspective, then we're just going to be another voice shouting in the mix out there. And I think this is really the tendency, isn't it, for I think those of us who work with younger Christians, because they see the importance of the issues and they want Christians to be part of addressing those issues, as Christians should be doing, and as Christians, in many sort of indefensible ways have not been doing for generations in this country. And yet you got to do it in a way that is shaped by the gospel. Otherwise you're just, joining the Twitter crowd. And so how to do that is, you can't teach that overnight. That's an ongoing community practice of formation.
We've got a couple of questions here about the Carver Project. One was just a question of, is there any kind of funding structure for the Carver Project?
Yeah, I'm going to take that question a little differently. I think I'll get around to what you're asking, but I will say funding has been a real challenge to this effort in ways that I did not anticipate, and I probably should have anticipated it. When we started this whole thing in a living room meeting, and there were 40 of us, and I sort of cast the vision and said, here's what I would love to see us do together, and I'm willing to lead this effort. I think it's going to cost me probably 2 books of my career, and I think I way underestimated that. It's probably going to end up costing 4 or 5 books, but that's okay. But as I kind of thought through the pieces and thought 5-10 years ahead, I thought the funding would be, if not easier, less complicated. And the reason it's complicated is that, and this is not news to many of you on this call, but anytime you talk about the importance of racial and gender diversity, for example, you lose a whole box of potential Christian funders, and that, billions of dollars locked up in loosely evangelical money that is just not interested in anything that sounds like it might be, I think from their frame, too liberal in a sense, right? And then the deck is further stacked against you if you're working in elite higher ed, which has its own baggage around those terms. And so I think that, for spending a lot of hours and a lot of days trying to say, no, this is why, I'm on the board of university, right? I know what it's like to be a Christian and have it cost me in these places. And that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that I don't care about the things you care about, but I also care about and know about the importance of racial and gender diversity. I would say for the kingdom and for reasons that, I'm preaching to the choir here, but also to be at all plausible in a university environment, you have to have that commitment as well. And so I think but it's made funding quite hard. I do think over time, the funding structure is sustainable for a couple of reasons. One, we're building a natural alumni base who are tied to, in our case, to Washington University. And so I'm waiting for my former law students to make it big and start making the big bucks and then giving back. But also we're finding, it's just taken a lot more time, but we are finding the partners, both locally and nationally, who see the importance of this vision and who trust me or who trust others in our orbit. And so most of the funding has just been individual donors and trying to build up a sustainable donor base. The other, I guess, frustrating piece of the funding effort has been how in the foundation world, both Christian and, Christian aligned foundations, how few of them are willing to take meaningful risks on new endeavors. And, a lot of them are still kind of stuck in the model. We're going to fund our friends. And, there's merit to that because there's trust involved in those relationships. But I think it could actually be a both and. And if more Christian funders were willing to say, we're going to take a risk on these 20 new startups, knowing that 10 of them might fail, but knowing that those other 10 that make it probably won't make it without us, that's a kind of, I think, forward-looking funding that could really open up some possibilities.
Makes a lot of sense. It sounds like a lot of realities that all of us in kind of the nonprofit and Christian world contend with. And
can I jump into? I just noticed Mike's comment on the chat there. Reproducibility, the first impulse within evangelical culture. Yes. Why is that? I mean, so when I'm talking with a lot of funders or potential funders, the first question is, well, tell me about scale. How are you going to grow this and make it bigger and replicate it? And I kind of want to think, well, I don't know. I just want to try to figure out how do we do this here first. And there's a little bit of, I think, false modesty there when I say that, because I actually think it matters that we're at a school that does have a national reach, and we have networks of Christian faculty across the country who, because I think there are very few faculty-led Christian initiatives, we can actually be a space that connects people nationally. And that's just harder to do you can't do that at every school. But I'm also, when I sit down with my board or we do strategic planning, my first thought is not, how do we scale the Carver Project? It's how do we invest more deeply in the community that we have, and how do we love our neighbor well on this campus, and how do we facilitate a place for other Christian faculty to be encouraged and strengthened?
Yeah. Follow-up question on the Carver Project had to do with emeritus faculty. Do you have emeritus faculty, or do you think that they could have a real role in contributing?
Yeah, that's a lovely partnership idea, and I think it illustrates so well how we can pull from various parts of the hands and feet of the people of God. So when by the time you're an emeritus faculty member and your administrative duties are lower, and maybe your teaching's lower, and your scholarship is not as intense as it might have been, what a great time to step in and mentor junior faculty for sure, but also engage in these kinds of efforts. I think it would be hard to pull off something like this with just emeritus faculty, because at least under the theory of change that we're pursuing, we want people who can immediately pull the levers inside the university in ongoing ways. But emeritus faculty are a tremendous resource who also bring a wealth of knowledge. And I think particularly in the mentoring of other faculty, one of the things we do is we have a couple of untenured folks in our cohort, and I always tell them, your only job right now is to get tenure. Once you get tenure, we'll get you to work for us. And so emeritus faculty could be a wonderful resource just to read people's work. You don't even have to be in the same discipline. I think one of the real things we're finding lived out in what we're doing is that Christian faculty, because we naturally want to be together with each other for a common purpose in Christ, the interdisciplinary stuff happens naturally. In a way, the university always wants that to happen, and it almost never does because it's very hard to work across departments and disciplines. But when you're with a group of people you already want to be with, it can start to happen. So the emeritus physics professor can read the essay by the untenured English professor and actually be a tremendous added value to that, even though they've got nothing in common with their disciplines.
You mentioned an article. This is more of just a very specific question. You mentioned an article earlier in your conversation that you and Tim Keller wrote together. Could you give us the reference to that, or let us know the title of that?
Yes. Well, no, I don't remember the title of it, but it was in Christianity Today, 2015, I think. They always put their stuff behind a paywall now, but it was, I think, around 2015 in Christianity Today. And what it does is it lays out, if you go look at that, you'll see the seeds of what became the Uncommon Ground book.
And perhaps somebody might even find that in the chat and put that up. That'd be great, so everybody can find that reference. My colleague on Emerging Scholars Network, I get to work with Hannah Eagleson, who's our associate director, and she just does a great job for us. She says we believe deeply in connecting folks to in-person communities, and also the value of connections through technology. I'm curious what you've learned through the pandemic about how to build community using online tools and gatherings.
Yeah, I think I'm behind the power curve here. I'm not, I think like everyone, I've realized that there is some value in this Zoom sort of work. And the biggest upside to me is we can see people who we might not be able to bring in person, but who would be willing to jump on a call for an hour. So I can help it helps us bring resources to people in more efficient and lower cost ways. And a lot of life is happening online now. I think, and I think it's, as we think about how we express things, there's been almost like a great democratization or equalizer of the online work. So I was thinking about this, where in order to have a national event at InterVarsity 2 years ago, you'd have to be at one of the big conferences, and now you can have your online event, and if you market it well, then it's a national event for InterVarsity. And so there's a way in which the local can have an outsized influence beyond the local. So those are all good things, but I'm kind of surviving on the non-online stuff right now. I have, with apologies for those of you who don't drink, we started about a week into the pandemic, a thing we called Whiskey Wednesdays in my driveway, where I had 3 faculty colleagues, and I would just every Wednesday, rain, shine, doesn't matter how hot or cold it is, we're in that driveway for 2 hours, just socially distanced, just to see each other, and it's been a lifeline. And so I think to encourage those, be creative, but be creative online for sure, but also be creative offline.
Yeah. You talked about reading groups, and could you say more about kind of the structure and purpose of them, and how those work, at least at WashU?
Yeah, in some ways it's interesting, because probably the whole impetus for the Carver Project traces back to these reading group ideas. And when I first moved here 10 or 11 years ago, I just thought, if there's enough interest, let's get some Christian students over to my house, and we'll read a book together and talk about it. So we did early on, we did Hunters to Change the World. We've done Newbegin's Proper Confidence. We've done Bonhoeffer's Life Together. We did Tish's book on Liturgy of the Ordinary, and the new InterVarsity book from Justin Early on a common something or other, common rule, common something. It's a great book.
That is a great book.
And we did an Andy Crouch book, I think, Strong and Weak. And so I guess a couple things that have made those work. One, and it's expanded beyond me to a bunch of other colleagues, but we always try to have them in faculty homes, because there's something about having students over to a faculty member's house that just breaks that wall.
Hmm.
And the second thing is we always try to have really good food and beverages for them. And so not skimping on the, the store-bought cookies if you can. I mean, spending a little extra money or a little extra time to give them good food, since a lot of people aren't thinking about giving them good food when they're students. And then we just open it up for discussion. I used to be a volunteer Young Life leader, so a lot of my relational background is Young Life. So we'll do the icebreakers and the informal talking. And then I always tell people, unless I'm getting on a plane the next day at 4 a.m, I tell people stay as long as you want. And so we'll start at 7:30 p.m. and go till 9 p.m. But then typically I'll have students talking till 11 or 11:30 afterwards, or sometimes we'll go out to one of the local pubs afterward. But just the informal relational time has been invaluable there. And we started this, the law school version, we started, I guess, 5 years ago. And I went to 2 of my research assistants who I knew were Christians. And I said, if we can find 2 other people, let's make it 5 people and get this going. And we went from 5 to 40 pretty quickly, and it stayed around 30, 40, 50 each year, which has been remarkable and exciting.
Yeah. Boy, that sounds fun. I'm almost tempted after COVID to move to St. Louis.
If you're willing to pay the tuition dollars, we'll take you in the law school.
And my wife says, no way. But anyhow, Zachary Baldwin makes the comment, have you seen or heard of similar kinds of conversations on faithful pluralistic engagement within the student affairs world? Are there particular scholars, practitioners you'd point to? There are a lot of people who are working in student affairs. It's a challenging area oftentimes for Christians. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's really important. I think one thing most people on the call already know this, but it's worth pointing out that the student affairs world is just a different part of the university than the faculty world. I know almost nobody I know a couple people in student affairs, but what they do and what faculty do is so separate in the modern university. And it didn't always used to be that way. Basically, faculty have outsourced over a period of decades all the student affairs-y relational work they used to do, and then the university hired a bunch of professionals to cover that work. But the divide has become pretty massive. And that world has its own culture and community and formation, and it proceeds in a very different way than even the faculty communities that form. My only real engagement with that world has been through my friend Eboo Patel, who runs an organization called the Interfaith Youth Corps. So he's a Muslim, not a Christian, but he's very much been engaged in that world, saying, how can you, and he's been a great friend to InterVarsity too, how can you open up an understanding and a space for religious diversity within student affairs? And he's made some headway there, but there's a lot of work to be done. I think I have almost no wisdom to offer there other than to identify that it's a massive need, and it's a real place where I think Christians could be thinking strategically of how to invest better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Katie asks about what kind of spiritual formation and discipleship do you think is needed to embolden tenure-track faculty to step out when they are established in their career?
The first thing that comes to mind is just the importance of doing this together and friendship. So much of the emboldening happens from looking around you and realizing that you're not alone. And part of, I think what we've done, this is why we spent a lot of time on our website, was to say, here are 16 people who are Christians at our school who are very much engaged in their faith. And then I think just to give people the encouragement of that. The other thing I think that comes to mind is a wisdom and a discernment. And so there's a time to be engaged publicly and a time to devote a bunch of your life to ministry efforts. And then if you're a faculty member, there's also a time to count the cost and sort of nose down to the grindstone and get the work done, especially pre-tenure. And I think there's a sense in which sometimes, because of probably a lack of mentoring, younger faculty don't always know how and when to make those distinctions. And so I think those of us who've been around a little longer, it's helpful to do that. And then the final thing that comes to mind is almost a pre-spiritual formation, and that's, can we work better and harder to find those Christians who will be the next generation of faculty? And can we identify and mentor them and help pipeline them and give them training and bring them together in a community? And this is something where in the Christian funding world, I mean, it's almost, people have almost surrendered the cause. There used to be 20, 30 years ago with Lilly money and Pew and a few other initiatives, these structures and funding for future Christian faculty. And there's so little of it today, but it's such an important need, and helping to find, the training and the work to get from graduate school to tenure track faculty position is really hard to do in the best of circumstances. It's only gotten harder. And if we can facilitate that through Christian community and networks and relationships, then that seems like the low-hanging fruit to pursue.
Stephen asks a really interesting question here. I appreciate how you've tied these virtues, humility, patience, and tolerance, I guess, to the theological virtues. What a great way to translate the theological virtues. I'm wondering how you might tether the virtues of humility, patience, and tolerance to that all ambiguous term of human flourishing, understood Christologically. Otherwise, it seems these virtues might be tied to other ideologies, thereby becoming lost in translation.
Maybe. I mean, so I think it's a fairly easy ask if you're talking about articulating that within the church or within a theological community. It's not to say we do it well, but at least, I mean, it's possible because we can name a shared end and purpose, and then describe the goals and the values toward flourishing from that shared purpose. And because we all agree on, I mean, for the most part, we are bounded theologically and scripturally as to what that flourishing is. It's an almost impossible question to answer in a pluralistic society or set of institutions, because it forces you to ask questions like, what's the common good? Or what's the purpose of a human being? And we those questions are not answerable today in a pluralistic society as diverse as ours is. It doesn't mean that it's the end of the game. It just means that question is very hard and maybe impossible to answer. So to me, the question is, can Christian communities flourish within broken institutions, whether at the meta-political level or the small I institutional level of a university? And I think the answer for Christians has to be yes, which gets us back to this idea of faithful presence. Can we articulate an understanding of human flourishing that is sometimes going to resonate with our non-Christian neighbors and sometimes going to be almost incoherent to them? But we're called to pursue that flourishing, not because we think we're going to win, but because we're called to faithfulness in the effort. So if I were trying to win at a place like WashU, that would be I think that's pretty much a lost cause. I don't, short of, the second coming, WashU is not going to be redeemed for Christ at an institutional level. But I think I and others, especially in community, can point toward flourishing within this otherwise broken institution, which also has a lot of good in it too.
Well, we're kind of coming to the end of our time. I wondered if you might just say a little bit more about the book and about some of the other contributors to the book and what people will find as they look at the different contributions to your book.
Yeah. So the first thing, I'm laughing a little bit, but if you go on on Amazon and look at the negative reviews, people are really mad because they discovered this was not a Tim Keller book. So, buyer beware here. This is not a Tim Keller book. It's a Inazu and Keller book with 10 other people. And but I also think it's very Keller-esque when you get into the substance. I mean, nothing in this book is what Tim hasn't said elsewhere. I just think that the multiplicity of voices adds texture to what we're trying to do, and I'm grateful for who came together to do that. One thing that's just sort of, we can all, those of us on the call who are part of InterVarsity in some way, can be grateful to God for, is this book. We didn't start out this way, but it turns out that InterVarsity's influence throughout this book is really quite prevalent. And so, I mean, most of you know, Tish used to be on staff. Tim Keller came to faith through InterVarsity. Tom Lynn is our president. I'm on the board. Claude Alexander is now on the board as well. And then even those who don't have direct InterVarsity affiliations have partnered well with InterVarsity. Shirley Hoogstra, who's the president of the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, and Trillian Newbell. Everyone has InterVarsity connections running through, and that's exciting for me to see as a board member, to see how our ministry is not just siloed, but is actually reaching out in all kinds of ways. And then the other thing I'll say just about the breadth of the contributors is, very deliberately, we're trying to cover a lot of different vocational lanes and spheres of influence. And so there's a chapter by Warren Kinghorn, who's a medical doctor and a theologian, and his approach to how to live out faith in a world of difference looks quite different than Tim's as a pastor or me as a law professor. And I think there's something exciting about that breadth. But the other thing that I'll say that comes out in the book is the thematic importance of race and differences across race and challenges that come from race to the effort to live faithfully in this world. And this is another theme that is known and important to InterVarsity, but it has to, I think, it has to stay on our radar as such an essential effort to continue both within the church and outside of the church. And that can be hard, especially when you're talking about things like tolerance, patience, and humility. But I think it's vitally important.
Absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much for a great conversation. This has really been a delight today, and so glad to have you on here. Want to just feature again your book, Uncommon Ground, and it's available wherever you purchase books. You were talking about Trillia Newbell, and she was a previous ESN Conversation participant, and just it was a delight to have on board, and I think you'll enjoy her writing. And as you said, this is really a stellar lineup of folks, and so diverse, very interesting. So I'd encourage you to pick up the book. It was a great read on my end of things, and I think you all would enjoy it very much.